everybody. Welcome back to the Restart Pod. Today we have a little short bit. Obviously, a lot of what we do is we kind of react to like what's the cultural tone in SF and what's happening on Twitter. And there was a podcast from Naval, and his guests were Gary Tan, two other guys, I don't know who. Um, and they're kind of talking a lot about like the politics, the culture of AI, what it's doing to society generally. And Gary Tan, like on Twitter, for those who aren't aware, he's the president of Y Combinator.
Yeah, CEO. Yep.
Yeah, CEO of Y Combinator. He's very, very AI pilled, like supremely AI pilled. Like everything he does is like agentic loops. In the podcast, says he spends like $100,000 a year on tokens. Like basically everything he does is like loops and loops and loops of agents, right? Um, and it kind of bothered me. I don't know how you reacted to it, Damon, but like how pro AI he was in a weird way. Like I guess like it was almost like undiscerningly pro AI. So before I kind of get into my like soapbox, I'd kind of love to hear like when you watch that thing, like Naval had one way of looking at things, Gary Tan had one way of looking at things, where you kind of lean.
Yeah, I think you said it well. I mean, I think just building a bit of context there, where I obviously speculating here, I haven't talked to Gary certainly, but where I think Gary's coming from is he sees 200 companies every 3 months, and those companies that are going through Y Combinator tend to be a little bit out in front of kind of the rest of the world with respect to the emerging capabilities. Now, oftentimes that means that they're just wrong, meaning like they think something is going to come to fruition that ultimately never does. But YC was famously way ahead of crypto when Coinbase was there, way ahead of kind of this you know renting out your home with Airbnb or otherwise. And so what you inevitably get is what I'm sure is true is Gary's context is flooded with people on the absolute edge of AI down this like jagged frontier. And so that is the dominant conversation he is having, helping these founders kind of understand where AI is going, where they can build, where they can differentiate, et cetera. And then he's having these other conversations with people who are less on the frontier and in his mind, months or even years behind where he thinks the actual current state of AI is. So the best way I can summarize it is that conflict that's kind of landing with some, I think, frustration in that conversation. Like he is kind of frustrated with what he deems a lack of context from the other folks on that call because he's sitting in 10 to 15 to 20 conversations per day that are talking years ahead of where that kind of conversation is landing. I actually find it somewhat emblematic of a lot of the conversations we're having right now. Like I've kind of experienced that similar phenomena in my own work. Meaning when I talk to folks in the heart of Silicon Valley, when I talk to folks who are engaging with early stage startups on a seemingly regular basis, they're all far more AI pilled, to use that term, than anyone else I speak with. And it
Right.
isn't months, it used to be months, but the divide seems to be growing. And the
Right.
divide is growing in a way that is leading to like almost two parties who don't realize they're differing parties becoming increasingly more different. So I don't really know what to do with that or to make of it, but I think just commenting on the podcast you're referring to specifically, I'm sensing frustration in Gary's tone that is probably misplaced, but I understand where it's coming from because I'm kind of sympathetic to it. I'm kind of having the
Mm.
same, um, I guess, dichotomy of conversations as well.
Yeah, it's kind of. I mean, I kind of end up in this weird spot with like. So, like, I don't know if I describe myself as like fully AI built. Basically, like anything I can do with AI, I will. That's like true, right? I won't send like emails or message people with like AI generated writing. Like at best, they'll be like, hey, like make sure like my like structure is kind of correct or like I'm getting my idea across correctly. And then like I'll take that structure and then write it in my voice, right? That's always what I'll do. And there's like a big discussion that kind of happens in that podcast, very specifically about like Naval has this like it's almost like a philosophical point, less so like a practical one about like if you're a human writing for humans, like you're kind of wasting their time by using an agent to create writing for them. And it kind of ends with this like undertone throughout the entire conversation that in my head, I don't know where like you and I both consume content, right? Like we both have like cues and both of us have like expressed a desire for like, hey, there's content out in the world. realistically, I'm not trying to like consume it all in like the long format that it comes in. I'd love to just get like a summary, like a digest, and that takes like a thoughtful thing and dilutes it down into its core values and elements into something that like a machine is writing the voice for, right? How much preservation there is on my ears and eyes of that content and the way that the person intended for it, is an unknown, right? I just kind of eat it the way it comes. But there's like a pending question in my head about like, if we look at art, if we look at these things that are like not purely productive inputs and outputs, I think a lot of folks are very reasonably concerned, like outside the culture of SF. Like SF, everyone's just like, oh, like throw like Claude at it, fix the problem, whatever. But I think reasonably so outside of SF, like the idea of like everything I'm consuming is machine generated, like strikes a really negative nerve for a lot of people. I don't really know where that goes. You know, like I think if you look at like what Fable is able to do, all of a sudden, like it's able to do video editing, and video editing was a really, really hard skill. We use video editing here that like I have Fable running in the background every time we record. Is there a loss of human touch and value and care in the construction of that product? If you and I were speaking and there was a thing built fully on our voice and fine-tuned on our like thinking, and it recorded the two of us, is that loss of human inputable meaning?
Yeah, I think I'm of two minds about this. Like, I think neither take is fully right, nor is it fully wrong. And what I mean by that is there is something innately human about wanting to digest things created by other humans. Like, I think humans are
Mhm.
just fundamentally more kind of affinity. They have higher affinity for other humans than they do for like machine generated, computer
Right,
generated things. Um, that said, AI is just the next evolution of technology that's doing this, and it's far worse in some vectors. And I'll kind of unpack all those thoughts. But just saying it simply, um, the same kind of debate or argument came up around animation or in computer generated graphics in movies and otherwise before. As people are like,
mhm,
oh, it's the death of the filmmaker when all of a sudden you could just use CGI to like hack fantasy worlds together. I don't think anyone would realistically argue that's worse for film overall. Now that there's
right,
some, I think some film purists that still think that's a kind of a cheaper or a shortcutted way to create content. I just don't think people actually consume it that way.
right,
And which kind of speaks to the larger point that I'd make here, which is humans want good content. I don't think they care nearly as much about how that content is generated, so much as the content is useful. And to where I
mm,
will agree with Naval completely is that AI lets humans be lazy in a way that punts the work to the receiver. Meaning, like, if I don't take time to distill the open ended brainstorming I do with AI down into like some sort of succinct memo or a single message that the reader or listener can digest, then I haven't done my job. Right.
right,
But if I can give them a more information dense, a more valuable work product, whether that be this podcast, whether that be a memo, a image, a graphic, a chart, a model, whatever I can give them, if it's more rich, if it's more information dense than what I could have produced otherwise, they are going to be appreciative of that thing.
right,
It doesn't matter if I used AI to do that or not. But AI is very verbose. Still, it kind of gets very blabbery. And if you don't condense it, if you don't concentrate it into the things that are most valuable, what you do is you take the work off of yourself and you punt it to your recipient. In which case, yes, that is lazy, and I think that will not be appreciated. Like, you're going to end up in this spiral that people have talked about, where it's like, I have my AI create something, I send it to you, you have your AI give you a summary of the thing that I just created to
right,
you read it back, and then you send me back responses in which I create summaries of said responses. Like, good writing fundamentally defines and makes the takeaways from the medium very clear, and that's still the work of the author. I just think you can do that well with LLMs. It just takes more effort than a single prompt or two.
yeah. I think in like the most optimistic case, and like when I look at someone like I haven't, so for the record, I don't think I've ever met someone in SF who's like, okay, actually not true. I met some people who are like, there's gonna be like no work to ever do for the rest of time when AI inevitably reaches like some tipping point that it's not there at yet, but it will happen, right? This writing statement you just made about like it's very verbose, whatever. Like at some point, will reach like human acceptable slash like if I'm speaking or I'm chatting with the model, I'm like, model, make a post about like AI anxiety. It will sound very much like me and maybe like it will cannibalize some of my thoughts that I've shared otherwise and put it in a way that I might structure it. In my head, I don't know that I like fully appreciate. I think there's two things. I think like the benefit of AI is that like yes, you can like do so much output, but the problem is that like I mean I don't know how, if you've experienced this, but with writing code, even when I'm writing so much of my code, like there's so much junk and so many like bloat features that end up in my thing just because I have the ability to build them, right? And not all of those are useful. And so in like a weird way, I think because you're enabling so much creation, like the ability to separate like what is quality from the general chafe ends up being really, really important, right? Like I guess like the things that people will come to appreciate will live many sigmas away from the mean, whereas like the amount of stuff in the mean will go up a lot, right? There'll be people who start writing who weren't writers, great, but if you're not well discerning about them, then you're just adding to a mass of generally ignorable garbage, right? And the more positive case, like if you're fairly discerning, right? Like if you're attaching your name to something that AI is creating, you would kind of hope that like at the beginning you're really structured at it. At the beginning you are like kind of like siphoning ideas and weaving them and constructing things that are generally novel. You let AI put it together in your sort of shape, and then at the end you're the kind of like final judge of what did it do? Does this meet my bar? And you would hope that your bar is very, very many sigmas away from the average quality bar that standout writing or standout film or standout anything is really appreciated. Um, I think it's just like the conflating variable in there, at least in like the content economy and things that like the general mass quote unquote consumes in the world of attention, is that like there is ultimately an algorithm that decides what it can show you. And so that means that there is like ultimately a reward function for content, right? There is not a subjective definition of what makes good content. And with an objective function, that is something that volume wins over being high precision.
Yeah, I guess my thoughts aren't necessarily different than that, but just adding a layer to it, it is enabling technologies, whether that it be AI in this case or other technologies prior, raises both the floor and the ceiling for users. So
Mm,
it makes poor writers or you know poor authors better, but it also makes the good ones greater, and the the good ones
right.
great and the great ones greater. And so I think the question that opens in my mind is whether or not you see increased widening between the floor and the ceiling that
Mhm.
AI now enables. In which case, I think you do. But in any event, I still think you get a higher floor and a higher ceiling, and then it again falls back to the human user to decide which one of those two thresholds they're going to build towards. Right? Like if I want
Yeah.
to write a relatively low impact document, I can now do that in 5 minutes, where it used to take me 5 days. Right?
Right.
But going through the effort to still make a very high impact one is an unknown amount of time because it's inherently subjective and qualitative. There is no kind of finish line in making a good written piece, right? So I still think the discernment falls down to the human commenting on what more work there will be to do after the AI takes over. In that kind of hypothetical, I don't really agree with that worldview. I think humans have agency, and like
Mhm.
yes, AI will become increasingly powerful, and yes, it will begin to erode parts of our current daily lives that maybe we don't like as much or that we don't want to cling to. But the kind of group agency of the human collective will just shift that attention elsewhere. As things become commoditized, we will move into the higher value rungs of whatever kind of new pyramid exists. So I'm not necessarily of the opinion that there's ever a final state of this. It's always just kind of
Mhm.
work in progress, and no matter how smart the AI gets, you'll still there will still be human value somewhere. Yeah, I think the somewhere is just the unknown.
Yeah, I mean, I think like if I look at the most enthusiastic shape of things, like the analogy that came to my head is like the likelihood we get the continuation of like the Game of Thrones books, which has been like a gigantic frustration to everyone, goes up because like writing a Game of Thrones book is obviously very, very onerous. I'm sure like he has ideas for what should happen in the continuation of the story. His like all of his like writing style and everything is preserved. And I don't think that like anyone would read like the next Game of Thrones book hearing it's AI generated. But in a world that like it's slightly more accepted that like, hey, for like generating a paragraph at a time, the idea of like getting more content that's not fan fiction actually to like the director or the reader or the author's vision ends up more likely, right? Like I think that even like the premise of like we're seeing this a little bit in like Hollywood of like these like new directors kind of bringing people back to theaters and that sort of thing. I think there's a general anti-AI trend. I don't think there is, I think reasonably so. Like even Barnes and Nobles and whatever, like you'll see like they started like labeling and selling AI written books, like books that are like at least facilitated by AI. And that's obviously like very, I think people don't like it. I don't like it for the record. But there is some version of that that is like, I think future digestible, that is like style, tone, diction, all this sort of stuff is something that you can kind of capture in a person. I think like there's some productive relationship between AI and human that ends up meaning that like my diction, even the process of writing is something that you end up molding, right? We're fixating on writing a lot because Gary fixates on writing a lot in that talk. But like in the process of writing, right, you like craft your idea, right? It's like a sculpture, right? Like you might have the general shape in your head, but in any sort of like creative act, you end up like in the process of doing it, learning more and changing ideas and thinking, right? I think that there's like some optimistic shape that is like poor content creators, poor writers, poor whatever will like not be sculptors. But for someone who's much more like, hey, like I'm putting out a product, I'm putting out a book, I'm putting out a movie into the world, whatever it is, like there's some productive use of this machine that still goes through like, this is my bar and this clears it. And it's acceptable to me that like I'm servicing a person at the other end, the receiver, the whoever's consuming it in a tasteful way that I think would hopefully survive. Like it doesn't make sense to me that like we'd get so much mass and all of that mass is being written the same like undiscerning way and there's any value in that scrap metal effectively.
Yeah, my thought there is currently, and at least by design, these AI systems are consensus finding machines.
Hmm.
And so the creative act is actually in driving away from that consensus. Or like if people just prompted AI for short stories, they would coalesce around the same kind of general arc and
Yeah.
narrative. It wouldn't write the same story every
There'd
time
be
because
no
it'd be
like
this
subversion. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But they are kind of always driving towards a kind of a localized North Star, if you will. And so I just think creativity moves from using this tool that, if you so choose, can give you superpowers, then
Hmm.
you can do that. I mean, I think I don't know if it was I don't know Mark Cuban said basically like AI allows you to learn nothing or it allows you to learn everything, and the path selected is up to the human user. You know, you can basically do no work with
Right.
AI or you can do all the work with AI, and I think that um, historically people that are the most ambitious and with the highest levels of agency do the most unique and creative and interesting things. I just don't think that's going to change. I think just AI becomes an enabler for whichever of those paths people choose. So I guess if I was to say anything, it would be um, choose wisely because you'll get
Yeah.
the outcome that you kind of optimize for.
Yeah. I think like the thing I'd also like kind of end with like just like building on that is that like the way that that talk goes, I think it itched me like specifically the wrong way, like the way Gary and his AI build is going, because like a lot of that comes from like, oh, I have like $100,000 of disposable money to spend on tokens, and I can just like do whatever I want, and cost of tokens will go down. Like anything he's doing, like I think reasonably, like if they're at the edge, more people will kind of bring that edge into their lives. Right now it's SF, but we might see that bleed out to like New York or Austin or any other like tech forward cultures. Um, but I think in general, like the things that Gary talks about being able to do, I think is like a little bit too far over the edge that will be end up, I think, getting corrected culturally. Like I think that there's a tendered experiment put to like try what you're doing with a fully anonymous account and see what ends up happening, because he's Gary Tan, he has an influence already, so anything he's doing is under the big public eye. Um, and I'm pessimistic that if he did everything he was doing under an Anon account, I mean, I'm in a number of like these like founder group chats, and everyone's like, I made a harness for XYZ. I made a harness for XYZ. And most of those are just like, why would I ever use that? Because we're all making them the exact same way. Why would I even look at your code base? Because we're all making them the exact same way. And they're all like commodity thinking usage, dot, 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 you know? And I think eventually everyone's going to get a little bit sick of that. That like the way we discern like what is really good right now, I don't even think we have a measure for that for like coding, but there'll be some level of like, there's a bar here. Like we don't know what that bar is or where how to like draw the shape of that line or where to start it. But culturally, there's something that I think like will reflect in the job market or reflect in like content and how it does that sort of thing that the algorithm would start rewarding subversion almost by implicit nature, that people just keep swiping on things that are like vanilla, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's worth stating here. It right now you get a lot of social points for saying AI is bad online.
Yeah.
You don't get a lot of social capital for being like pro AI in very many circles right now. And I think we're at a reasonably relative nadir, kind of the bottom of that. I
Right.
think people are going to come around on what AI is capable of, the kind of inevitability of its future anyway. And so I do think I agree with you. Gary's probably too far in one direction, but I think also public sentiment's too far in the opposite direction. And so
Mhm.
we'll see a little bit of reversion on both those means probably in the coming, months.
Right. Anyway, we'll see. Bubble conversations are really hot right now too, so I'm sure that's not also not helping. But in any case, weird time in the world. Like even I think these clips that we're posting right now, like I will be throwing a lot of weird edits at them, and they'll all be AI. And for whatever it's worth, like said the strangest way, like letting the AI edit is working very marginally and incrementally, but it is working. It's like taking time off my plate that like I can describe I want like a like jump cut edit, and it just does the jump cut edit without me knowing CapCut, you know? And that is time saved. I'm not doing something incredibly novel. I'm just kind of bringing ideas to it, and it works. And there's something there that like again there is a line, but like to me like that's nowhere near it. And I think that's going to be more firm and declarative by the continuous cycles of this thing and whatever comes after Fable being even better at these kinds of work. I guess we'll leave it there. Thank you all for joining. We'll catch y'all later. Peace.